Nkosi sikeleli Afrika maluphakanyiso.
This is Steve Zeltzer with Workweek, and the imposition of tariffs by the Trump government has led to devastating consequences for workers all over the world and for people in the United States as well who face inflation and layoffs because of the trade war. And joining us today is Patrick Bond. He's a political economist at the University of Johannesburg and has been studying what is going on economically in South Africa and internationally, and also what's happening in the struggle of the working class in South Africa. Welcome to our show, Patrick.
Well, it's great to be back with you and your viewers, Steve. Thanks for having me.
So, why don't you talk about the impact of the trade war that Trump has launched on South Africa and Africa, and what does it mean for the working class, and what has been the response to it?
Yes, it's obviously a trade war that has implications across the world, and South Africa has had, just by way of background, a little bit more of the pressure points because of the, let's call it the anti-racist tradition and the anti-genocide movements by the government against the State of Israel in the International Court of Justice, which very much implicates the U.S. for its funding and militarization and its legitimation of the Israeli regime and the decimation of Gaza right now. Something that obviously when Donald Trump wants to just clear everyone out and take it over as U.S. property and build some sort of Riviera. Well, South Africa stands in solidarity with Palestinians, and that's probably the single biggest site of conflict. And the second being affirmative action, that is land reform and Black economic empowerment, which means that some of the Black bourgeoisie are given a piece of the action from every foreign investor. And several, the most important, was born not far from here in Pretoria, Elon Musk. They don't want that. Musk is also at the same time negotiating for his SpaceX satellite internet service, Starlink, to be brought here, and he doesn't want to have a Black partner. That's obvious enough. So when you put those together and you say, well, there are several things that the U.S. aid cuts that started in January, February, decimating about 18% of our AIDS medicines budget and prevention and treatment, which has not been made up by a very neoliberal government, which is now going through a big budget crisis. And then you put on top of that the climate, let's say, Just Energy Transition Partnership, JETP, $1 billion loan. It wasn't a great loan. It was at market rates. The main U.S. Subsidy there goes to help the New York bankers as a special loan guarantee. There was also $56 million in grants. Those would have probably been helpful for South Africa's decarbonization. And on top of that, then there's, let's call it the AGOA threat. So the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act is indeed the site where the most concern about tariffs being raised, because this is a zero tariff program. And its main beneficiaries, Steve, have been the auto companies, Mercedes and BMW and VW and Toyota and to some extent Ford. And those companies have had zero tariffs from the imports U.S. gets from South Africa, plus steel, aluminum, and as well, we've had quite a strong recent upsurge in citrus and vineyard products, grapes, and wine. Now, as that gets cut, because what Trump has done is just gotten rid of all of those, we can expect two things. One is that the U.S. consumer will consume less in general because those prices represent a higher inflationary attack on their living standards. So the working classes of the U.S. who might have got some of those relatively cheaper cars or steel or aluminum or citrus or grapes, wine from South Africa, that's now going up. But secondly, that it's differentially going to hit South Africa, because what Trump has done is put 25% on all steel and aluminum. And automobiles, it's a little bit more complicated because of some concessions that the car companies have been able to win from especially Mexican and Canadian imports. But, Steve, it's just one of these wacky times when it's such a zigzag of positions, and where I think the other factor for the working class is when the China trade war really gets underway, unless it's somehow halted, then there's a huge overaccumulation of capital. That is, excess production. It's not just sort of excess capacity that the U.S. complains about in the green energy, let's say the electric vehicles and the batteries and solar panels, that we know we need so much more of, and to use the terms excess capacity in describing solar is ridiculous. But it's all the other activities in the capitalist sector of China that is now probably going to result in vast exports that were going to the US now going everywhere else. And already South Africans have put, the government has put tariffs, punitive tariffs against imports of steel and tires and things like garden tools, all sorts of things that come from China are already considered dumping, even though, South Africa and China are together in the BRICS and allies in so many ways. So let's say that this effect on the working class will be lower wages and lower employment in some of the vulnerable sectors. How much, we don't know, because this is still such a dynamic situation.
And maybe you can talk about the effort of Trump to bring the Afrikaners to the United States and the whole racist ideology, fascist ideology of the Trump government and his supporters, Musk, Peter Thiel, and David Sachs from South Africa. What role do they play? Because a lot of Americans are shocked that these South Africans have now been put in place to basically run the US government, the Doge, and to run cryptocurrency. These people have been put in the top positions, the state apparatus in the United States. Who are they, and
Yes,
how did they get in that position?
yeah, and how do they become such monsters as white South African boys raised in the 80s? I wonder how. Yeah, they were being trained, Steve, to run the apartheid system or the corporate elites of South Africa in the most corrupt city, according even to PwC, of world capitalism, Johannesburg. I'd add another, the editor of Breitbart, Joel Pollack, who was born but moved very quickly. I mean, I think within weeks of his birth, his parents emigrated, but he was hoping he would be the US ambassador to South Africa and was on the TV and commenting the last few weeks regularly with the kind of arrogance and I think intelligence as well. I mean, the guy's very smart. He wrote a biography of his mother-in-law, who was at one point a leftist, so it's very interesting characters that you get. I would say, yeah, the South African, let's say, boys that we produce, especially in this city, Johannesburg, Elon Musk being the most notorious because he went to high school here, Bryanston High School, and he was thrown down a couple of flights of stairs and beat up, and so he was so badly hurt. He calls himself beat nearly to death by his peers. And so he's 2 months in hospital and then over to a different high school in Pretoria. But his father, who he doesn't like, his father, Errol, says, well, actually, Elon, I couldn't defend Elon on that because Elon had been teasing another boy about his father's recent suicide. So that's why the sort of beating up exercise, the hazing, the bullying. And that's what little white boys, I think, are accustomed to here in this awful city, is basically being, Wild West. They might have started brilliant little fellows like Musk was, autistic and probably knew some African languages from his nanny. But then they get, as 1% kids often do, they get trained to be absolute bastards. And now the next thing about this problem of Afrikaners is I'm not sure quite who is feeding this myth that there's some sort of genocide or systematic murder of white farmers, but it has gone quite a long way, and it's something that Trump himself raised in 2018 when he was already trying to kind of keep South Africa down. The crucial point in all of this, though, as Trump regularly puts out on his Truth Social, is that South Africa is hosting the G20. Johannesburg is the host city. We were supposed to have Marco Rubio come in February. Scott Bessent was meant to be in Cape Town with the finance ministers in February. So these ministerial meetings that are very important to kind of getting momentum and getting some solutions to global crises, as if we could expect the G20 to do that. U.S. is boycotting, and Trump very clearly said he intends to boycott. Now, something else has just happened this last week, which is Volodymyr Zelensky visited, and Cyril Ramaphosa, who had been very clearly leaning to Vladimir Putin as a BRICS ally, and with the old historic Soviet support for the African National Congress as a big constituency, including labor. advocating for stronger ties with Russia. But I mean, what Ramaphosa hopes to do, it's not entirely implausible, is play some sort of mediating role. You know, he did the same in my own hometown, Steve, that's Belfast, Northern Ireland, in the late 90s as the Good Friday Agreement was, you know, being monitored in the early 2000s as well, before it was implemented in 2005. Ramaphosa went to make sure the Irish Republican Army had kept all their arms caches sealed away. So he had sort of had some function, let's say, in legitimating these sorts of peacemaking exercises. And he did bring African heads of state last June to, well, it was in, June 23, so a year, nearly 2 years ago, to visit both Zelensky in Kiev and also Putin in Moscow. And nothing came of it. It was a bit of a waste of time, a bit of a PR exercise. But Ramaphosa has these ambitions to be seen now as the chair of the G20, hosted here in Johannesburg, as someone who can actually do deals. And then that would give him the opportunity, he thinks, to have a game of golf. He keeps talking about, his press secretary keeps saying, we just want to bring Donald Trump out in the golf course. I don't think they know he's a notorious cheater. Actually, maybe they do. But the point being that they're in this position of flattery. The other thing that they did, the New York Times reported on in February, is to pledge offshore oil and gas potential fields that we don't really know because the exploration hasn't gone very far. Total and Shell and some local guys, and even Brazil's state-owned company, as of late last year, Petrobras, they're already doing this seismic blasting. And they think there are some oil and gas, especially methane gas fields. So, of course, there's lots of protests, more than 100 protests across the Indian Ocean, in the south, and on the west coast, the Atlantic Ocean. And so it's going to be a very messy situation if that's indeed what the offsetting deal that is being offered to Trump and his oil company friends, ExxonMobil and Chevron and Anadarko and Peabody. And if that goes forward, then you'll see much more intense contestation of trade deals with South Africa. The working class, angry about all sorts of things, but not yet focused enough, not yet doing serious protests. The last protest we had against one of these trade deals was when South Africa hosted the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act conference in November 2023. And it was just after the Israeli genocide had begun. And unfortunately, we couldn't pull all the trade unions out of that meeting. Both COSATU, the mainstream tied with the ANC, and NUMSA, the metal workers, which of course most vulnerable because of the aluminum and steel and auto workers, jobs being on the line if these cuts happen. And, you know, Steve, I'm always asking my friends in, you know, these institutions, there's a lot of electricity that goes into aluminum smelting and digging the iron and digging out deep gold and platinum and all the things that we do with our minerals energy complex. Lots of electricity that goes into the automobiles. So if we do have a lower effective demand from the West, from the US, and then next year from Europe because of carbon border adjustment mechanisms, another kind of trade sanctions, climate sanctions, then maybe that electricity should go to labor-intensive industry, maybe even small businesses and households. But the point being, we're always facing shortages. The last few days, what we call stage 2 of blackouts, of load shedding. And I think that is the sort of debate I'm hoping the working class begins to grapple with, which what should we do with dirty electricity? How do we phase it out? How do we have a genuine green just transition? Meantime, if Trump is really going to kill some of that market from South African exports to the US, and we think regardless of what happens to the rest of the tariffs, he has a really nasty streak when it comes to South Africa and South Africans in these sectors. Again, aluminum and steel and automobiles. Well, that electricity maybe would do much better for job creation and economic development than as it currently stands, big multinational corporates who produce, take the profits away, and don't reinvest.
Well, the deindustrialization of Africa and simply using it as a place to get resources, metals, minerals, is the policy of both the United States and China. But you raised the issue of Putin and Zelensky, and raised the question of multipolarity idea that there's another alternative to U.S. imperialism. From the point of view of South Africa, the working class in South Africa and Africa, is multipolarism going to help out in solving this inter-imperialist rivalry that's taking place?
Yes, I mean, whether what we're describing is a multipolar challenge for example, to de-dollarize, to try to have less Federal Reserve control over, printing money, quantitative easing, which they do, 2009 to 13, and then again in 2020 to 2022. That's the sort of power that the Fed has, but also to raise the interest rates. Jerome Powell jammed them up in early 2022, and I'm sure your workers in the U.S. and certainly countries and corporates and consumers and the working class here got really nailed by those rising interest rates to the extent that three successful economies, Ghana, Zambia, and technically gone bankrupt because they couldn't pay with the huge interest rates. So getting a de-dollarization is the one big test. But BRICS is meeting in July, and I've just been told, unfortunately, Lula is too intimidated because Donald Trump, who came out in December, in January, in February, at least 7 times to say, if the BRICS try to de-dollarize, try to set up some alternative to the US dollar, they will be hit with 150% tariffs. So there's a lot of bullying, and unfortunately, we have very weak, even someone who supports the BRICS, Vijay Prashad, will openly admit now, the political will doesn't seem to be there. And even Lula, who had the, let's say, strongest potential to stand up for left internationalism, is now fading away. I don't think in July in Rio de Janeiro we can expect anything out of the BRICS, anything to challenge US imperialism. In fact, I would even call it, Steve, sub-imperialism. It works within, just like those global value chains, therefore, in which the Chinese can take from the Eastern DRC child workers, in many cases, the coltan and the cobalt, the gold, and all the other minerals, $24 trillion worth is estimated under Eastern DRC, and take it out and bring it to the Rwanda illegally instead of through Kinshasa to get taxed, and then get it to east coast of China or Chengdu, where the Foxconn factories are really exploiting or super exploiting the workers. They are under an apartheid-style hukou migrant labor system, where the particularly cheap workers, because they don't have urban living rights. And that then brings the profits mostly to Cupertino, California, where you've got Apple that does the distribution, the research and development, the marketing, the sort of management of the whole process of financing. And that's unfortunately the imperialist relationship with sub-imperialist China to plunder from workers, children, and the environment of African, South African troops until they were defeated in battles last month. They're basically a couple of thousand sitting on the airport in one of the major cities in the Eastern DRC called Goma. And they're basically prisoners of war by the M23 rebels backed by Rwanda. And these are the sorts of situations, Steve, where I'm not finding much multipolar optimism these days. I'm finding sub-imperial relations with world capitalism, where Donald Trump is breaking some of the rules, not the neoliberal or neoconservative rules that have been adopted by both Democratic and Republican parties, but rather a paleo-conservative isolationism based on not just the xenophobia and the racism, the Islamophobia, the misogyny, but also protective tariffs as a central tool to try to get more deals out of the victim countries, which South Africa now looks to be, I think, durably one of the most serious. And that means our working class, I think, has to be more exceptionally vocal in their anti-imperialism. We haven't seen it yet, except for South African Federation of Trade Unions, who did put out a statement against both NATO and the Russian invasion of Ukraine as Zelensky arrived. But I mean, it's a very difficult situation where there's a labor aristocracy element and a sub-imperial element in our trade union movement. And we can't even, for example, get a metal workers union to stop its workers from providing the coal, because they're Glencore employees, and they're also employees at the same time of in a joint venture with President Ramaphosa's brother-in-law. His name's Patrice Motsepe. We can't even get the metal workers to stop those workers from exporting coal, along with the transport workers along the rail line or the trucking lines out to Richards Bay, the main port, which then goes to Hadera. And we see every month one or two of these coal ships, 177,000 tons of coal, which are supporting the genocide, fueling it, because that's where the IDF gets its electricity. And as we know, in Gaza, no electricity.
And of course, Zim's line, the Israeli shipping line, continues to operate in South Africa. During the Clover struggle, the ANC, the Ramaphosa government, allowed the Wertheim family, which owns the largest dairy business in Israel, was able to buy Clover, which is the largest dairy in South Africa. And now apparently their imports of farm products or milk products from Palestinian land, which has been taken over by Wertheim's company, now being imported into South Africa. It seems that Israeli capitalist, Zionist capitalists in South Africa are making money profiting from labor in South Africa and exploitation of labor. And this is a campaign around coal, stopping coal to Israel, to the Zionists, the ANC. And where are the unions on that? You're saying the unions are not really taking up that campaign.
Well, with the exception of GUWUSA, the General Industrial Workers Union of South Africa, who has very, very good leadership, very strong in Palestine, which is the main union at Clover. As you said, they ran a campaign. It was also a campaign to prevent massive job losses, and there were cutbacks in the wages. So these are struggles in motion, and of course, the coal would be the single most important. Only Colombia exports more coal to Israel, and that's in spite of the fact that their wonderful president, Gustavo Petro, very left in rhetoric, coming out of a guerrilla tradition. He was the mayor of Bogota, and he has said he doesn't want to see Colombian coal going. But Glencore and an Alabama company called Drummond, they just keep that coal flowing. And I'm not sure where the barrier is. In South Africa, our trade and industry minister, Parks Tau, says we can't go against the WTO. Non-discriminatory clauses, and we don't have any basis for saying you shouldn't ship coal. I mean, just complete nonsense. Given WTO is now considered just roadkill on Trump's crazy trip to wherever he's wanting to take us on tariffs.
And the growing crisis of capitalism on a global level is, and from your point of view, is actually exacerbating the economic crisis in Africa. What would be a policy in South Africa and Africa as a whole to fight this new imperialist crisis, this crisis of capitalism, and the imperialist rivalries that are going on?
Yes, I mean, when you say imperialist rivalries, it's also, you can tell within the US, and when an Elon Musk gets hit and loses about $130 billion out of his 440, I think it is, and when the Tesla brand is just destroyed, and when people are encouraged to go and protest at the Tesla dealerships, and some vandals are going and burning Teslas, and it's a disaster for him to have been at the front line of what I would call a classic neoliberal austerity. And we're feeling that same austerity. In fact, it's a former trade unionist named Enoch Godongwana, who's our finance minister. The last few weeks have been, let's say, similarly tense over budget cuts here. And we're basically successful, even from the right, the main partner of the African National Congress, in fighting off a new value-added tax, a general sales tax increase. He'd wanted to go from 15 to 17%. This is, by the way, the former general secretary of the metal workers. I knew him well in the old days, and he was quite the Marxist, but people make their 180 degrees, and this is what happened to Enoch Godongwana. What does that mean? We would love our government to stand up more. To its credit, the foreign ministry under the former minister, whose name was Naledi Pandor, she retired at the middle of last year, I'm sure under pressure from Ramaphosa, or from pressures on Ramaphosa not to reappoint her. And the replacement, Ronald Lamola, isn't quite as able to go out and raise the Palestinian flag. But I think what we learned in both those instances, like a BDS against Elon Musk, so successful, so satisfying to see this little brat from South Africa, taking that sort of financial hit on the one hand, and also the success of BDS against Israel, because it's the kind of thing that Trump feels he has to absolutely ban and prosecute at various universities, and it's made illegal in so many ways. So I think that is actually where social movements and progressives around the world have to step it up. I think a BDS USA, and I'm hearing that from those, for example, in the progressive movements in the U.S. I mean, even Robert Reich and at Berkeley, and the foreign policy in focus editor. These are individuals, but I'm hoping we're going to see, as South Africa did, a call by organized labor, by the civil society forces under attack, that maybe the United States, and particularly those companies that are supporters of Donald Trump, and again, it's the big data companies, that they be subject to a global boycott, divestment, sanctions by ordinary people. What policy terrains could we develop? It's very hard. We have an African continental free trade agreement that could be the sort of site where you stand back. You say, well, we're not going to have U.S. markets in this. Let's accept that. Let's put tariffs on U.S. goods coming in. That's what China's done with some, I think, success, at least in these early days. And then you'd sort of say, well, what would we want to do with an African continental free trade agreement so as to avoid South African corporates that, by PwC's reckoning, right, this PricewaterhouseCoopers, very, very corrupt. I don't have any fear of saying that, online, because lawyers won't go after me because it's so true. And PwC does measures of corruption, and Johannesburg has traditionally been the number one city for economic crime and fraud, as they put it, whereas our civil servants under Transparency International's annual ratings, they ranked in the sort of bottom half of corruption. I think we were 107th out of 180 countries in terms of the sort of most corrupt, not even in the first half. So let's say that the ability of our working class to engage in serious struggles against a very, very predatory capitalist system will have to also include U.S. companies. And I think at this point, it's, footsac. It's for the G20. The call I've been hearing resonate a little bit, I make it certainly, is to vote Donald Trump off the G20 island, if you know what I mean. I mean, to sort of say, instead of Donald Trump hosting this group in 2026 as is scheduled, make it a G19. Maybe you should have it in Mexico with Claudia Sheinbaum. She seems to be a kind of tough character who can stand up and take over a global group when the U.S. just doesn't deserve to be in it with the climate sanctions. And that is pulling out of climate agreements. We would have to put climate sanctions on the U.S. like they're going to be put onto other countries from Europe and UK starting next year, and also the public health dangers that the U.S. has imposed by pulling out of WHO and with RFK Jr. sort of vaccine denialists. We see some major problems coming in pandemic prevention with huge U.S. aid cuts, starvation in Sudan intensifying, with humanitarian aid much lower, not just from the US, but also from many European countries. And then you have this destruction of world trade and world financial markets, completely chaotic. So I think actually now an isolation of the US has to be discussed earnestly by those who are opposed. And then the G20, I can only think of two, Steve, Javier Milei in Argentina, and Claudia and George, what's her name again? Meloni. Yeah, Georgia Meloni from Italy. I mean, those are, I'm guessing, two who would stand up for Donald Trump, saying, no, don't throw him out. But, this was actually tried by Barack Obama in 2014 to throw Vladimir Putin. Not only did they throw him out of the G8, it's the G7 now because of the invasion of Crimea, but they tried to throw him out of the G20. And then the BRICS, South Africa's leader at the time included, Jacob Zuma, stood up and said, no, you can't do that. But I think this time actually would be kind of 18-2, or actually now we have the AU, and then we might actually see some very interesting changes. Partly the US is pulling out, the State Department shutting down nearly all of its African consulates. The rumors, maybe a draft paper suggests. And with the US in such an isolationist version of imperialism, which is extreme military, the Yemenis, the Palestinians are feeling that. And with such extreme problems in so many ways in which Donald Trump is expected to do business in your own hemisphere, in Greenland and Panama, pressures from Canada, I think actually a global movement to do something about US capitalism in its paleocon mode, not just neolib and neocon, will be very, very welcome. What we've got is a multipolar rhetoric from the BRICS, but a sub-imperial practice. What we've got from social democrats in Mexico and Colombia, maybe in Sri Lanka and Senegal, the sort of four of the lefty-oriented countries I can think of, is they're just too weak. But the one hope, Steve, to conclude this idea of standing up, not just being knocked down and trying to play a game of golf with the oppressor. The one hope is something called the Hague Group, which on January 31 got together with South Africa at the lead, but also Malaysia, Colombia, Bolivia, Cuba, Namibia from Africa, Burkina Faso, I think was one. So you get a few countries saying we're going to defend the International Criminal Court in The Hague against the U.S. sanctions that were just, piling in on them at that point. So I think that would be a sort of model. Unfortunately, there's so much hypocrisy that both Colombia and South Africa signed that they wouldn't allow military fuel to go to Israel. That's part of the Hague Group statement. But coal exports, we've really got to do more disciplining and accountability mechanisms, which our activists here, our Palestine Solidarity Committee, the BDS movement, certainly is working hard on protests against Glencore. middle of last year, and just a few weeks ago against Patrice Motsepe, the brother-in-law of the president, who's the main partner of Glencore. And I expect that to continue.
And of course, China is invested not only in resources, but also in banks. The Standard Bank in South Africa is owned by the Chinese. So they have a massive investment. Is that?
Yeah, 20% owned, which we don't yet know if that's decisive, but it seems to be for the one big project which China is very involved in, China National Overseas Oil Corporation, CNOOC, with Total. It's called the East African Crude Oil Pipeline, Standard taking up the lead financing position. So you're absolutely right to mention this Chinese relationship in financial capital that then becomes fossil capital.
And there have been struggles in South Africa of the miners, the independent miners are dying in the mines. Why don't you talk about that? Because that exploitation, Marikana, I think there were some attacks on these itinerant miners without regular jobs. What are the conditions for mine workers in South Africa?
It's terrible in what you're describing. The nickname here is Zama Zama, which take a chance. They tend to be mainly immigrants, and Mozambicans and Zimbabweans predominant, some from Lesotho. And they've been in the mining industry for many years, decades, because the way to keep wages low is to have migrants, because that way you don't pay the full cost of the social reproduction of the worker, being fed by a woman. And so the woman's way back in the Bantustan or another country. And that system, migrant labor, then gave way to all sorts of continuing systems of desperation, immigrant desperation. And yes, there is xenophobia. But there was also solidarity in the most important site. It was called Stilfontein. It was a mine that at one point had some Anglo gold ownership, Anglo-American, but really has been one of these mines that goes down 2.8 kilometers. So the deepest, by the way, in the world is not far away, Carltonville, 4 kilometers deep. That's how deep this huge gold seam went. It's half the world's historic gold underneath where I am now, but stretching out a couple of 100 kilometers. Now, when you get that sort of, let's say, depth of mining, and then much of the gold remains within the columns, the pillars that hold up the mine, well, you're going to get very desperate people going into old mines that haven't been properly sealed and scraping the walls and scraping those pillars. So it's very dangerous, and mafiosi sort of operations have emerged. But it's much better than just starving to death, which is the other choice for so many workers. We have about 65% poverty rate here, and from the region even higher. And that means when there is some social organization, there is an affiliated network of Zama-Zamas, they do have a way, and they connect to communities, such that we learned of the mass death. I mean, there were 87 corpses found in the one mine, Stilfontein, but we can, I think, reasonably guess well over 100 others that will never be recovered. And these are people who starved to death because of government policy that started in the middle of last year, smoke them out, as the presidential spokesperson said. And that was to basically get rid of these illegal Zama-Zamas. And with the rhetoric that, well, they're stealing from us, yes, but I mean, the minor bits of gold are taken when you compare it to the sort of real plundering by white monopoly capital, by the big mining houses. It's just nothing. So this is a terrain that we're on here, where we've got a real lumpen proletariat, very desperate people forming into networks and mafioso arrangements. And then, of course, the profits go to the middlemen and to those who are in the distribution system. But when we could see just how brutal the South African state was, at the same time, President Ramaphosa was saying to the G20 at their big meeting in Rio last November, we mustn't use food as a weapon of war. Well, his own presidency was saying that back home while he was in Rio, saying we're going to smoke them out and starve them to death, these Zama-Zamas. So, yeah, as I said, probably hundreds died in that particular incident. And there's 6,000 mines that haven't been properly closed, that are basically abandoned by the owners who don't want to pay environmental liabilities for cleaning up, or even to basically seal them. So it's a terrible situation where probably 100,000 mine workers out of maybe 400,000 or 500,000 in the whole value chain of mining and smelting really are desperately trying to scrape together a living. I think the only solution is ultimately nationalization of not just the minerals under the ground, which is part of most countries, including South Africa's basic laws, but actually to go in and start to nationalize the rest of the mining operations. But that'll still take a lot of organizing, and as part of the regular demands of Freedom Charter, 1955, the ANC's own Bible said we're going to, the mineral wealth will be shared. Well, it hasn't been. It continues to be looted. I must say that, we had a really high point of prices in the world economy, 2020, 21, 22. They peaked in May 2022. And then they've all crashed. So coal went from $400 to $100 a ton. And we do a lot of coal exports, regrettably, not just to Israel. But then you've also got gold, and that's still soaring because of all the nervousness. It's up to $3,300 per ounce, which compared to its low at $250 about 25 years ago, it's extraordinary. So those gold fields are certainly making a lot of money. Also, as our currency declines, there's lots of profits that come in terms of the local operations that weren't there before. So we really need to see what the windfalls are. And to do that, I think, next election is municipal, 2027 and then 2029. A couple of the parties do have that nationalization agenda, but the ANC remains basically embodied within the minerals energy complex, who captured them quite a long time ago, including Ramaphosa, a mining tycoon himself.
Well, there have been some efforts to build a mass workers' party in South Africa. Like the United States, there's no working class party in South Africa. NUMSA apparently tried to build a party with the support of Roy Singham in South Africa. That failed. It got less votes than even the membership of NUMSA. And there is no working class political alternative, mass working class political alternative in South Africa. What efforts are being made to build a working class party in South Africa that you would unite the working class politically with a program for nationalization of the mines and the wealth under workers' control in South Africa?
But, from what I can say, I can't be terribly optimistic. As you said, the NUMSA Socialist Revolutionary Workers' Party is still on the books. They do have a structure. You're right that they got less. In fact, they got 1/10 of the votes, right, in the national election, 25,000 or so, less than 1/10 of their membership, which is over 300,000. So the next project looks to be a mass workers' party called a Labour Party, but it's a very ambiguous leader, Joseph Matunjwa. He, for example, hasn't joined any of the struggles for free Palestine because of a Christian Zionist background, but he was a very brave man at the Marikana massacre as the leader of the amalgamated Mine Workers and Construction Union, AMCU, and he then was able to take from the old ossified pro-ANC union, the one that Ramaphosa led, the National Union of Mine Workers. He was able to take most of those platinum mine workers, Marikana, and then in other sites. So if he can launch a Labour Party based on a more, let's say, rigorous approach, I'm not sure. They failed to get onto the ballot in the election that was last May. But I think there's a hope that at some point more reasonable forces will come forward from other center left and left parties and will form some sort of broader, let me call it a united democratic front. That was the name that in 1983 did bring such forces together and did play that central role locally here in overthrowing apartheid. Now, what would that consist of? We have a number 3 party, which is really seen as a sort of Zulu nationalist party, the Zulu people, led by Jacob Zuma, plus lots of corrupt politicians. And so there's a real concern about this MK party, which got 15% last year. Then there's the next party, the 4th party, which has been a sort of cheeky young populist left party, the Economic Freedom Fighters. They're down to about, I think, probably a ceiling of about 10%. And then you have a few others that might qualify as sort of left-leaning. But I'm not sure it's going to really be in the electoral realm, at least before 2029, that we see the working class finally get fed up. And what we could see, frankly, from the last few weeks of negotiations over budgets, Steve, was a hurtful, a fed-up sense that society had with a finance minister who was being, his chain was being yanked by the International Monetary Fund. 100 mentions of the 2 words fiscal consolidation in just the last 3 IMF reports over the last few months. And the IMF has a $4.3 billion loan made in 2020. South Africa is paying off, and it has these austerity conditions. So I think that's actually where we'll see sort of, let me call it a sort of class struggle displaced into the state. And it really reflects in things like, here I am in a middle-class bohemian suburb near the university, and many nights my water doesn't turn on because the state doesn't have enough workers to fill the gaps in the system that are breaking the holes, the leaks, and the waters. If you leave it in the reservoirs overnight, it'll just go down so fast because it just runs out because of the leaks. And that's the sort of terrain we're on, where austerity is has basically broken our municipal state, our city of Johannesburg. This was the richest city in world history because of having half the world's historic gold, and now we can't run water systems. That's the extent to which, let's call it a sort of overall degradation. The austerity regime since the mid-1990s has undermined municipal governance and state services more generally.
And privatization, of course, has been the policy of the capitalists internationally. The United States has demanded it, and the AFLCIO was supporting policies of capitalists to keep an agenda of privatization around the world. And you had some experience with the AFL-CIO, and recently, one thing that Musk has done, the Doge and Trump, is to shut down the National Endowment for Democracy, which funded the AFL-CIO Solidarity Center. They were getting over $70 million a year for operations in 62 countries. They have 26 branch offices, and they were involved in trying to overthrow the Venezuelan government. They been involved in, even before the Solidarity Center, in the Chilean coup, and also supporting right-wing trade unionists. And in the case of South Africa, they supported Buthelezi, Chief Buthelezi. In fact, he was given the George Meany Award. And while and given $1 million by the AFL-CIO from the CIA, which was then used to massacre trade unionists in Zululand who were organizing unions. You had some experience with the AFL-CIO and its operations in Africa, which now are apparently going to end because of what Trump has done.
Yeah, I think in this case, it's kind of, okay, the Solidarity Center, what good did they do? I'm not too sure I could say anything positive. I certainly did see them in Zimbabwe, where I was working as a sort of volunteer technocrat with Morgan Tsvangirai, the then leader of the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions. Early 90s, they just said, no, get rid of Patrick Bond, and otherwise your money's taken away. So I do know that. I can say that with confidence. What else they've done here, I don't know, but I think Kim Skype spoke about how the manipulation of the progressive forces in the South African unions, including, as you say, support for well, here it's sometimes called black on black violence, but basically the paramilitary gangs of Mangosuthu Buthelezi, and then was a sort of prime supporter of keeping a certain kind of capitalism alive in South Africa, which benefited U.S. corporates, and the U.S. AFL-CIO got a new nickname in that process, the U.S. AFL-CIA, and that was that tragedy of where the labor aristocracy and good movements in the U.S. I worked in quite a few trade unions in the U.S. and they just simply couldn't muster the power to shake loose foreign policy from this imperialist network, and that of course goes back to 1940s when the U.S. was very concerned that the labor movement in Europe would become a force of communist influence because of the prestige that the Soviet Union had at the time, having been the main force defeating Nazism. And I think when you look at that U.S. imperial project and that Elon Musk is breaking it and breaking it and breaking it, there are a lot of things that we're very angry about because lots of people will die of new HIV infections, less support for the very, very good civil society forces and the state in giving out free antiretroviral medicines. Thousands, millions will probably suffer from hunger, maybe to the point where it's fatalities because of Musk. I mean, he's really getting up to Adolf Hitler level of deaths and destruction. And I think the fact that, okay, we can give you from Johannesburg an Elon Musk and on the other hand, give you Trevor Noah and Tyler, the great young singer, and Charlize Theron, but we're very embarrassed when we think of the damage that Musk has done. Maybe this one exception, Solidarity Center, I don't think anyone I know in the labor movement here really gives a damn that it's gone.
Last, you were part of a conference, BRICS from Underground, that happened. What was the results of that conference and what happened there, and why was it held?
It's interesting. Every year we do BRICS from below in one way or another with a small group of radicals in civil society, including labor, and academics like myself, people who have a certain, let's say, freedom to be critical, mainly because we're utterly irrelevant. And so we can continue to have, building up these critiques. We're trying it this year in a way here in Johannesburg. The last time we did BRICS from below with about 1,000 protesters in Sandton, which is the same part of Johannesburg, the central business district, where we're going to see the G20 leaders come in late November. But we were put about 4.5 kilometers away, right, about, I don't know, 3-something miles away, on a hill where we couldn't get anywhere close to the actual scene. And I think that may happen again. There will be angry people, and already those concerned about Palestine, even a protest last weekend at the Cape Town consulate of the U.S. State Department, and they may close that. They may close the Johannesburg consulate, which is a logical place for people to march protests from and to the Stanton Convention Center. It's a few blocks away, and I'm not too sure what's going to happen because there's a C20, Civil Society 20, which is the more civilized society. Sometimes the sort of NGOs that are kind of maneuvering. I want to say one name, of course, you'll know, Oxfam, which sometimes has some very progressive positions, but in the whole scheme of things is more about class snuggle, not class struggle. And I think the fact that they've hit the ceiling on what they can do already with the South African government, they've had big splits, personality battles, means that a more uncivil society will probably be seen again and again. And I expect it to be not just Palestine solidarity and climate activists. We have some very good protesters here in Johannesburg on Extinction Rebellion and the Climate Justice Charter Coalition, Climate Justice Coalition, the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. We have some activists. We have some feminists that do anti-mining, anti-extractivism. We have a group called Earth Life Africa, where their leaders won the gold medal. I mean, we have a great network on environment. We also have people that have been destroyed because of the healthcare cuts. Academic programs like at my university and the other main university here, WITS, just stopped overnight. The clinics just shut down. The workers in health, the people who need the antiretroviral medicines, they're all, I hope, sufficiently, first, they can get a defense and preserve their livelihoods and get the medicines. But also, I hope they can come out and join protests against the G20, which, as far as I can tell, isn't doing anything much to offset the massive climate, public health, emergency response, sort of humanitarian aid and now trade problems caused by Donald J. Trump. And if we can do a, BDS Trump and work hard to kick Trump off the island for the G20, we'll be doing our part. But I hope it'll be in sync with everybody else in the world.
I want to thank you very much for joining us. We've been talking with Patrick Bond. He is a political economist at University of Johannesburg and an expert on economic development in South Africa and Africa and the global economy. So thanks for joining us.
Great to be with you, Steve.